Do you believe that language can become a deadly weapon during World War I? A group of American soldiers used indigenous languages to create codes the enemy could never break. If you were in those trenches, would you trust the power of words? Share your thoughts in the comments. Rain pounded the trenches of Argonne, turning the narrow earthen corridors into rivers of mud. Soldiers slipped and struggled through the muck, their boots heavy with water and clay, every movement a battle against exhaustion. Over the roar of distant artillery and the sharp crack of rifles, an almost imperceptible whisper drifted through the air. They spoke in a language the enemy could not break. The words were carried not by the wind, but by the soldiers themselves, uttered quietly, yet with authority, commanding movements, transmitting orders, saving lives. A U.S. infantryman wrote in his diary, the ink smeared by rain and trembling hands. We heard them speak, and no one else could understand. The sounds were like magic. Each syllable was a shield, each phrase a sword against the unseen enemy. The diary described not just communication, but the feeling that something greater was at work, an unseen presence guiding them through death and chaos. The Argonne Forest in 1918 was a landscape of terror. Shell craters scarred the ground, twisted barbed wire clawed at boots and uniforms, and smoke from explosives mixed with the earthy scent of rain-soaked soil. Amid this, certain voices cut through the confusion, words spoken in indigenous languages that were indecipherable to German ears. Commands delivered in these secret languages moved like lightning through the lines. Troops responded instantly, confusion replaced by cohesion, hesitation replaced by precision. Orders became weapon strategies, invisible yet impenetrable. Military dispatches later recorded the phenomenon, noting that critical operations were executed flawlessly because the enemy could never decode the language being used. Yet the soldiers' own accounts added layers of wonder and unease. They spoke of shadows flitting along the trench edges, glimpses of figures that seemed not fully of this world. Some claimed that ancestral spirits walked beside them, whispering guidance, warning of incoming fire, offering comfort to men facing death at every step. These voices were more than words. They were prayers, charms, and protective talismans. Every message carried weight beyond the literal. A single command could redirect an entire unit, prevent disaster, or turn the tide of a firefight. And each message carried the silent presence of heritage, culture, and memory, an invisible network linking the past to the present ancestors, to sons in mud-caked boots, the living to the spirits who watched over them. Soldiers whispered that when a comrade fell, the words themselves seemed to pulse with sorrow and rage, as if the language was aware, as if it mourned and retaliated at once. These were not ordinary men, and this was not ordinary warfare. Here, in the chaos of World War I, communication became an unseen force, a supernatural edge that could not be stolen or replicated. Words spoken in tongues long ignored by the wider world became shields against death and keys to survival. Each command, each whisper, was a secret preserved in the shadowed corridors of history, a testament to courage, ingenuity, and the invisible power of voices that refused to be silenced. It was late September 1918, and the Argonne Forest stretched endlessly under a slate-gray sky, scarred and shattered by months of relentless combat. The once thick canopy of trees had been ripped apart by artillery shells, leaving jagged trunks jutting out like broken spears, their branches hanging limp and lifeless. Rain had soaked the soil for days, transforming the trenches into treacherous rivers of mud that clung to boots and uniforms alike. Every step was a struggle, every movement a test of balance and endurance. The forest itself seemed alive with tension. Mist slithered along the ground, curling around shell craters and fallen trees, masking the enemy's movements and turning the terrain into a disorienting labyrinth. Soldiers spoke in hushed tones, their words barely rising above the patter of rain, listening for the faintest whisper of movement. The wind carried a mixture of scents, wet earth gunpowder, and the metallic tang of blood. A distant cannonade rattled through the forest, shaking the ground and sending shivers up the spines of those in the trenches. Among the American forces were the code talkers, men chosen not only for their bravery, but for their unique linguistic heritage, drawn from tribes including the Choctaw, Cherokee, and Navajo. They carried a gift that was invisible to the enemy, yet vital for survival. Their voices moved through the chaos with clarity, transmitting orders and relaying information that could not be intercepted or understood. In a landscape dominated by confusion, these languages became living weapons, shaping the battlefield in ways that artillery could not. The trenches themselves were a claustrophobic maze carved into the earth with barely enough space for two men to pass. Wooden planks and sandbags lined the walls, offering scant protection against the relentless barrage of artillery. Rainwater pooled at the bottom, forming sludge that swallowed boots and filled socks with icy cold. Soldiers had to wade through the muck, their bodies exhausted, minds frayed from days without rest. The ever-present danger of enemy snipers and machine gun fire created a constant hum of fear, a tension that tightened muscles and quickened heartbeats. In this hostile environment, ordinary senses became heightened. Every splash of mud, every creak of wooden boards, every distant whistle of a shell was a potential threat. Amidst the sensory chaos, the code talkers' voices cut through with surgical precision. Their commands carried not only practical instructions, but also psychological reassurance. Men moved with purpose, following orders no outsider could comprehend, their confidence anchored in the reliability of this secret communication. The language became a lifeline, an invisible cord linking soldiers across trenches, guiding them through danger, coordinating movements, and saving lives. The forest also bore witness to a more ethereal presence. Soldiers reported fleeting shadows at the edge of vision, whispers in the wind that seemed more than coincidence. Some claimed that the spirits of their ancestors walked alongside them, invisible guardians lending strength and foresight. These whispers were interpreted as omens, warnings, or guidance, and they became intertwined with the soldiers' understanding of the code. The language they spoke was more than a tool. It was a conduit for tradition, culture, and spiritual connection, blending strategy with the unseen protection of those who had come before. Every crumpled map, every message passed along the lines, every word uttered in the secret tongue carried weight beyond its immediate function. Orders became prayers, reports became incantations, and amidst mud, blood, and gunfire, the invisible web of communication stretched across the battlefield, binding the soldiers together in an intricate pattern of survival. The Argonne Forest was not merely a battlefield. It was a crucible testing human endurance, courage, and ingenuity. The weather, terrain, and enemy fire conspired to push every man to his limits. In this environment, the code talkers were more than soldiers. They were living instruments of war, channels of ancestral knowledge, and silent heroes whose contributions would echo far beyond the mud and gunfire. Even today, the forest carries the memory of those events. Its hollowed trees, scarred soil, and the whispers of wind through the branches echo the presence of the silent heroes. Here in the rain-soaked trenches of Argonne, the stage was set for a story of courage, secrecy, and unbreakable human spirit. This was the theater where words became weapons, heritage became strategy, and the impossible became reality. The Argonne Forest, in late September 1918, was a place where time seemed suspended, where the sky hung heavy with gray clouds, and the earth itself had become a battlefield of endless pain. Months of relentless shelling had transformed the dense woodland into a shattered landscape. Trees were twisted, their trunks snapped, splintered wood protruding like jagged teeth. The forest floor was littered with the remnants of war, barbed wire tangled like thorny vine. Shell craters filled with rainwater and the scattered remains of supplies abandoned in the chaos. Rain fell almost constantly, soaking uniforms, boots, and the very souls of the soldiers. Every step through the mud was a struggle, each movement fraught with danger, and every breath was heavy with the scent of gunpowder and decay. The United States had entered the European conflict only a few years before sending waves of fresh troops to the Western Front. Among them were men who carried a unique advantage: fluency in indigenous languages passed down through generations, preserved in communities that had endured centuries of displacement, survival, and resilience. These men, the code talkers, became living ciphers, invisible yet indispensable on the battlefield. Their voices, spoken in Choctaw, Cherokee, and other native tongues, became instruments of war, allowing commands, coordinates, and critical information to travel intact across lines where conventional communication was often intercepted or misunderstood. Official military dispatches confirmed that these communications saved countless lives. Reports from officers highlight operations where the enemy was baffled, unable to anticipate troop movements or artillery strikes, because the messages were delivered in languages they had never heard. In several documented instances, German intelligence intercepted radio transmissions or field messages, only to find gibberish, a puzzle that yielded no clues. In the chaos of battle, this advantage was decisive. Small squads, coordinated ambushes, artillery batteries were positioned with precision, and reinforcements arrived exactly where they were needed, all thanks to the silent, unbreakable code carried in the voices of indigenous soldiers. Yet alongside these verifiable facts exists another layer woven from the soldiers' personal accounts, whispered stories and legends that arose in the trenches. Diaries and letters reveal that the code was more than a practical tool. It was perceived as something almost supernatural. Soldiers described the words themselves as carrying a protective weight. In the dead of night, when rain drenched the trenches and shells screamed overhead, some claimed to hear whispers beyond the spoken message. Shadows flickered in the corners of their vision, figures moving along the trenches that seemed not entirely of this world. These were interpreted as ancestral spirits, guides who had watched over their people for generations, now manifesting to protect the men in the mud and fire. One diary entry from a Choctaw code talker describes a night when his patrol became disoriented in the dense fog. German machine guns erupted from a concealed ridge. Amid the chaos, he relayed orders in Choctaw. The squad navigated the fire with eerie precision. He wrote, "It was as if the forest itself listened and parted just enough to let us through. I felt eyes on us, watching, guiding." Whether interpreted as superstition, heightened perception under extreme stress, or genuine spiritual experience, the narrative conveys the profound connection between language, culture, and survival. The code was more than strategic. It was sacred, imbued with heritage and ancestral presence. The forest amplified every sound. Each splash of mud, creak of a plank, and distant whistle of a shell could mean life or death. The soldiers' senses became acute. They read subtle cues in the environment, attuned to movements that others would miss. In this sensory overload, the code talkers' voices cut through with crystalline clarity. Commands delivered in indigenous languages moved like threads through a tapestry, connecting scattered units, coordinating movements, and synchronizing actions that would have been impossible in conventional languages under fire. Soldiers also reported more mysterious phenomena. Some claimed to see figures at the edge of vision just beyond the mist, moving silently along the trenches, vanishing when directly observed. Others felt the presence of protective spirits guiding them to cover or warning of incoming fire. Stories of these experiences circulated in whispered conversations between patrols, forming a shadow folklore of the trenches. Soldiers began to refer to the code itself as the voices in the rain, a living presence that not only conveyed information but also offered unseen protection. The juxtaposition of factual records and folklore created a labyrinthine reality, Maps and official documents demonstrate the tangible effect of the code's successful attacks: artillery strikes, precisely timed, and enemy forces caught off guard. Letters and diaries add the ethereal dimension, ancestral guardian spirits moving through mud and mist, and words carrying protective energy beyond their semantic meaning. Soldiers describe the code as alive, responding to the stress, danger, and emotional state of those who spoke it. When a comrade fell, the words themselves seemed to vibrate with sorrow and defiance, as if honoring the fallen and warning the living. Rain and fog made the forest even more treacherous. Visibility was reduced to mere yards. Sounds became amplified. Each distant boom, the echo of rifle fire or the splash of mud underfoot, heightened anxiety and sharpened attention. In these conditions, the code talkers were a lifeline. Their words were not only instructions, but psychological anchors. Confidence returned to men who had been paralyzed by fear. Hesitation was replaced with precision, and the line between survival and death narrowed with each transmitted phrase. Cultural memory interwove with operational necessity. Each language spoken carried centuries of history, ritual, and community. The soldiers' use of their native tongues in battle was an extension of identity, a declaration of presence, and an assertion of resilience in the face of unimaginable destruction. The forest became a stage for this convergence of past and present culture and warfare, fact and legend. The code talker's role was not limited to relaying orders. They interpreted, adapted, and improvised under fire their cultural knowledge, providing solutions no standard communication method could achieve. When terrain, enemy interference, or weather disrupted conventional channels, the code talkers maintained cohesion. Artillery units moved on precise timing, reinforcements arrived as scheduled, and squads executed ambushes flawlessly. Each success reinforced the mythos surrounding them. Fellow soldiers began to perceive them not only as colleagues, but as bearers of a secret power, men whose words carried the weight of generations. Folklore intertwined further with daily life in the trenches. Some soldiers recounted dreams in which ancestors appeared speaking in the same languages used on the battlefield, delivering advice or warnings. Others claimed that the cadence of the code itself influenced enemy behavior, creating confusion beyond tactical understanding. Whether true or the product of heightened stress, these perceptions shaped morale and inspired courage. The legend of the code talkers grew within the trenches, feeding on every near miss, every successful maneuver, every inexplicable twist of fortune. Documented evidence supports these claims: after-action reports, maps, and intercepted enemy communications all show the efficacy of these codes. German intelligence repeatedly failed to decode or anticipate movements, and American success in the Argonne offensive is often directly linked to the use of indigenous languages. At the same time, letters, diaries, and oral histories preserve the folklore, showing how the soldiers themselves experienced a reality where language, culture, and the unseen converged in the mud, rain, and fog. The Argonne Forest was not merely a setting, but a character in this narrative. It shaped the soldiers' experiences, amplified the danger, and interacted with both fact and folklore. The mud and rain created physical challenges. The mist and shadows introduced psychological tension, and the constant threat of death heightened every sensory input. In this environment, the code talkers' voices became a lifeline, a shield, a bridge between survival and doom. The forest bore witness to acts of ingenuity, courage, and unseen protection that would remain hidden for decades. By the end of the offensive, the role of the code talkers had cemented a legacy. They were not recognized immediately, their stories suppressed by the secrecy of military intelligence. Yet their impact was undeniable. Operations succeeded, lives were saved, and an invisible force had emerged on the battlefield, blending tactical genius with cultural memory and ancestral presence. Soldiers carried the memory of these events in their diaries, letters, and whispered stories, ensuring that fact and folklore were intertwined in the legend of the silent heroes. In the fog-filled trenches of Argonne, words became weapons language, became strategy, and culture became a shield. The forest, scarred by artillery, soaked by rain, and haunted by shadowed figures, held both the literal and the legendary. For those who survived, every syllable spoken in indigenous languages was a lifeline, a prayer, and a testament to the enduring power of heritage. Even today, the hollowed trees and misty craters echo with the dual reality of history and myth, inviting the audience to step into a labyrinth of fact, folklore, and the invisible presence of the silent heroes. The Argonne Forest was a theater of endless peril. Rain fell in relentless sheets, turning trenches into flowing rivers of mud, filling shell craters with cold, murky water. Soldiers' boots sank, their uniforms weighed down, and the air was thick with the smell of wet earth, gunpowder, and blood. Every step carried risk, every movement might be the last. The canopy above, shattered by months of artillery, allowed mist to seep into the trenches, distorting perception and turning the landscape into a maze of shifting shadows. Even the most seasoned soldiers felt the weight of tension pressing on their shoulders, hearts hammering with the rhythm of incoming shells. The code talkers, indigenous soldiers skilled in languages incomprehensible to the enemy, became lifelines in this chaotic environment. Their voices carried over trenches, communication lines, and scout reports, created a network of clarity amid the fog of war. Yet, as the offensive unfolded, strange and unexplainable incidents began to accumulate, turning ordinary battle operations into episodes of heightened tension, mystery, and legend. One patrol, sent to observe a ridge obscured by dense fog, relied entirely on Choctaw-coded instructions transmitted from their line. The soldiers advanced cautiously, navigating shell-cratered terrain and tangled barbed wire. When they reached the ridge, the enemy machine gun nest they expected to encounter had been mysteriously abandoned. Shells that should have struck them instead fell short, their trajectory inexplicably altered by wind mud, or perhaps something unrecorded. Soldiers later described seeing faint footprints that did not match their own tracing paths through the mist, as if the forest itself had opened a passage. The patrol returned to the trench network with no casualties, and the event was recorded in diaries with a mixture of astonishment and reverence. I do not know if it was the words or something older one soldier wrote, but I felt invisible hands guiding us, protecting us from death. Other mini-cases followed in rapid succession. Scouts navigating the treacherous terrain reported fleeting shadows along trench edges, shapes that vanished when approached, and whispers that seemed to echo in the rain-soaked forest. In several instances, patrols reported avoiding enemy fire through sheer instinct, prompted by words delivered in code. Sometimes, enemy gunfire hesitated, misfired, or stopped altogether in areas where code-based coordination allowed American soldiers to move in ways that should have been impossible. These anomalies were documented across multiple units and regiments, adding a layer of unexplained phenomena to the already tense battlefield. Disappearance became another layer of mystery. Soldiers occasionally vanished during routine patrols, only to return hours later with fragmented recollections of traversing landscapes that did not match the maps or coordinates they had been given. Some claimed to have followed whispered guidance through fog and mud, emerging in positions far from danger. Others described hearing voices that were neither friend nor foe, warning of hidden traps or alerting them to incoming shell fire. Commanders concerned only with the operational outcome noted the return of these men, but could not explain the extraordinary circumstances. In private diaries, however, these accounts became the stuff of legend, evidence of a reality where survival was guided by more than mere skill or chance. The environment amplified every incident. Thunder rolled overhead, shaking trench walls and dislodging sodden timbers. Rainwater pooled in unexpected places, creating reflective surfaces that distorted shadows and made movement deceptive. Explosions sent mud and debris flying, providing temporary cover, but also masking potential threats. In these conditions, the code talkers' voices acted as a constant anchor. Every order, every message carried men across deadly terrain, coordinated artillery strikes, and kept units intact despite the chaos. Soldiers relied on these transmissions for more than instructions. They became psychological anchors, a tether to order in a world dominated by chaos. The psychological impact on troops was profound. In the trenches, men lived under constant threat, and every unexplainable event intensified both fear and awe. Reports of ancestral guidance, whether interpreted as spiritual, symbolic, or psychological, were widespread. Soldiers spoke of whispers in the wind-shadowed figures moving through mist and inexplicable safe passages through heavily mined or shelled areas. The code delivered in indigenous languages seemed to carry a living energy, connecting the men not only to each other, but to generations past. Survival became intertwined with belief skill and the perceived intervention of forces beyond comprehension. Several documented operations exemplify these rising incidents. Artillery coordination transmitted entirely via code neutralized enemy positions, while minimizing friendly casualties. Infantry advances that should have been halted by machine gun fire succeeded without incident. Scouts reported phantom movements alongside enemy lines, appearing and vanishing with uncanny timing. The recurrence of these events across different units created an internal legend, reinforcing the idea that the code talkers were not just messengers, but conduits of an unseen force that influenced both the terrain and the outcome of engagements. Weather terrain and relentless enemy pressure created a near-constant state of sensory overload. The crash of falling trees, the splash of boots in mud, the whistle of bullets, and the boom of distant artillery demanded hyper-awareness. Soldiers had to filter through a cacophony of stimuli to distinguish danger from illusion. In this environment, the code talkers' words were as essential as any weapon, their cadence dictating movements, survival, and morale. The rhythm of speech became a lifeline, guiding units through what often seemed like a labyrinth of death mud and mist. Ordinary patrols transformed into exercises of survival and legend. Soldiers recounted navigating trenches that seemed to rearrange themselves, avoiding sniper fire through directions received in code, or witnessing shells narrowly miss by inches as if diverted by unseen hands. The repetition of these events across regiments contributed to a growing mythology. The code talkers were protected, guided, and perhaps even empowered by ancestral spirits. Every command carried the weight of heritage, turning words into weapons, prayers, and protective talismans. The duality of fact and folklore became pronounced. Military records and intelligence reports confirmed the operational effectiveness of the code movements, executed flawlessly, artillery strikes coordinated precisely, and enemy forces confounded. Meanwhile, personal accounts, letters, and diaries preserved the folklore. Spectral guidance voices in the mist, and inexplicable survival. Together, these layers created a labyrinthine narrative that was as psychological as it was tactical. Soldiers operated within a reality where language, culture, and spiritual presence converged to shape outcomes on the battlefield. Nightfall in the Argonne added another layer of tension. Darkness intensified fear, made shadows animate, and turned the forest into a realm of uncertainty. Patrols moved with extreme caution, relying on code transmissions and instinct. Diarists recorded that the code seemed to carry not just information, but protection. Soldiers described a sensation of being watched, guided by unseen eyes, or hearing a protective whisper in moments of imminent danger. In the trenches, these experiences were shared quietly, reinforcing group cohesion and belief in the invisible safety provided by the code and its speakers. The relentless rain and fog transformed the terrain into a psychological labyrinth. Paths were obscured, trenches flooded, and shell craters created treacherous obstacles. The soldiers' senses were stretched to their limits, and their reliance on code talkers intensified. Commands in indigenous languages became an invisible web, guiding men through minefields, artillery zones, and machine gun fire. The forest itself seemed to respond as if alive and attuned to the cadence and rhythm of these words. Soldiers believed that the forest, the mist, and perhaps ancestral spirits conspired to protect them when the code was spoken correctly. Many incidents accumulated into a tapestry of rising tension. Scouts reported crossing enemy lines without detection, guided by whispered words in the fog. Units avoided artillery strikes that should have been catastrophic, navigating shell-pocked terrain through paths that seemed to open just enough for survival. Soldiers described seeing shapes moving alongside enemy positions vanishing when approached, or hearing voices warning of danger moments before it occurred. These incidents blurred the line between tactical brilliance and unexplained phenomena, creating an atmosphere in which survival depended as much on cultural memory and belief as on physical courage. The culmination of these rising incidents created a palpable legend within the ranks. Code talkers became figures of mythic status men, whose words carried not only strategy, but an almost spiritual protection. The forest rain mist and chaos of war combined to amplify the effect, turning everyday orders into lifelines and ordinary patrols into episodes of suspense and wonder. Soldiers internalized the dual narrative. Fact and folklore intertwined, history and legend converged, and the code became a living, breathing force on the battlefield. By the end of the offensive, the effect of these rising incidents was undeniable. Units reached objectives that should have been impossible. Soldiers survived encounters that seemed certain to be fatal. And the legend of the code talkers was cemented. Their contribution was both tactical and intangible operational success, interwoven with a sense of unseen guardianship, ancestral presence, and the mystical power of words spoken in languages the enemy could not comprehend. The forest retained the echoes of these events long after the guns fell silent. Hollowed trees, mist-laden craters, and scarred earth preserved the memory of both factual victories and the whispered legends of soldiers who walked through peril, guided by code, intuition, and ancestral presence. Rising incidents in the Argonne created a labyrinth of tension, suspense, and mystery, a narrative thread that would carry the audience deeper into the story, drawing them inexorably toward the next chapter of this extraordinary saga of silent heroes. The Argonne Forest had transformed into a labyrinth of mud-shattered timber and smoke-choked air, a place where the boundaries between reality and perception began to blur. By mid-October 1918, soldiers had spent weeks in trenches exposed to incessant rain, cold, and the unrelenting roar of artillery. The earth itself was torn and waterlogged. Every footstep threatened to swallow a boot, or worse, a man entirely. The dense canopy shredded by shell fire allowed mist and fog to seep through, obscuring vision, disorienting men, and turning the battlefield into an unpredictable maze. Among the troops, the indigenous code talkers had become pivotal figures in the theater of war. They were chosen not merely for courage or combat experience, but for fluency in ancestral languages that the enemy could neither understand nor predict. Their voices moved through the trenches, across shell-scarred landscapes, and through the fog, carrying commands that coordinated artillery strikes, troop movements, and supply lines with unerring precision. In reports, commanding officers emphasized the operational success achieved through these transmissions, noting that entire attacks succeeded without detection or disruption. Enemy intelligence failed repeatedly to decipher the codes, leaving German units disoriented and vulnerable. Yet beyond the measurable tactical advantage, soldiers' diaries, letters, and oral histories reveal a dimension that official reports cannot capture. These accounts describe phenomena that verge on the supernatural. Men spoke of shadows flitting along trench edges, voices carried by the wind that seemed to deliver guidance, and paths through shell-cratered terrain that appeared to open just for them. Patrols that should have been caught in deadly crossfire emerged unscathed, and men credited the code talkers' language sometimes combined with the inexplicable presence of ancestors or protective spirits with their survival. One documented incident involved a Choctaw code talker leading a small patrol to scout a ridge enveloped in fog. Enemy machine guns were positioned along the crest, and any misstep would have resulted in instant casualties. Using the code, he relayed orders that allowed the squad to navigate safely. The soldiers described feeling unseen, hands guide their steps, as if the forest itself conspired to protect them. When they reached the ridge, they found the enemy positions abandoned. In his diary, the code talker wrote, "The words I spoke guided them. I felt eyes on us, watching, steering our path. The forest listened, and we were alive because of it." This combination of fact, tactical maneuver, successful scouting, and folklore, ancestral guidance, forest responsiveness illustrates the dual narrative that permeated the trenches. Similar incidents recurred across units. Scouts flanking enemy positions encountered empty encampments where German forces had been expected. Others reported whispers in their native language, warning of hidden traps or incoming shells. Soldiers recounted fleeting shadows along trench walls, shifting in the mist, never fully materializing. Some believed these were the spirits of ancestors, silently walking with them, offering protection and guidance. Diaries often juxtapose these experiences with tactical notes, creating a layered record, a tangible operational success, intertwined with inexplicable phenomena. The environment amplified these occurrences. Heavy rainfall turned trenches into rivers, shell craters into deadly water traps, and the fog into an all-encompassing veil of uncertainty. The soundscape was equally oppressive. Distant artillery booms reverberated through the forest, rifles cracked sharply, and the occasional scream punctuated the cacophony. Amid this sensory overload, the code talkers' voices acted as a lifeline. Orders were transmitted clearly and instantly, allowing soldiers to move in coordinated patterns and avoid ambushes and execute maneuvers that seemed almost preternatural in their precision. Psychologically, the code talkers' presence had a profound effect. Soldiers developed a trust not only in the strategy conveyed through the code, but also in the protective aura surrounding it. Reports describe men experiencing moments of uncanny safety where shell fire narrowly missed them, or paths through treacherous terrain appeared as if laid out for their passage. These phenomena were often interpreted as ancestral intervention, the code acting as a conduit for guidance from those who had come before. In letters sent home, soldiers described the forest as alive, listening to their words and bending reality in response to their utterances. Operational records corroborate the effectiveness of the code. Artillery units struck targets with pinpoint accuracy, infantry movements avoided detection, and enemy forces faltered repeatedly. German reports noted repeated confusion, inability to anticipate maneuvers, and mysterious patterns of retreat and hesitation. Yet, alongside these facts, folklore thrived. Soldiers recounted instances where the cadence of spoken code influenced outcomes beyond explanation. Shells that should have struck landing zones missed by inches, enemy patrols stumbled into traps, and entire units survived encounters that seemed inevitably fatal. These accounts, though anecdotal, were consistent across multiple divisions, reinforcing the legend of the code talkers as bearers of both tactical genius and supernatural protection. Many cases abounded. In one, a small scouting party separated from its main unit found itself encircled by fog and enemy positions. Using Cherokee code, the code talker transmitted precise instructions, enabling the squad to navigate through concealed artillery zones and return safely. Veterans' accounts later noted that the soldiers felt guided by invisible hands or whispered counsel that warned them of hidden dangers. In another case, a patrol avoided minefields and machine gun fire after following instructions in Choctaw, later remarking that paths seemed to shift, creating safe corridors where none should have existed. These episodes blurred the line between strategy instinct and perceived supernatural intervention. Fog and rain compounded the tension. Trenches filled with water turning each movement into a calculated risk. The mist distorted shadows, creating the illusion of movement where none existed, while simultaneously masking threats. Soldiers had to distinguish reality from perception, relying on instinct and the guidance of the code talkers. The rhythm and cadence of words became critical, serving not only to coordinate actions, but to anchor the soldier's awareness in a constantly shifting environment. Words became lifelines, carrying men safely through danger, shaping outcomes and reinforcing morale. Ancestral influence was frequently cited. Soldiers reported visions of forebears moving alongside them, whispering guidance or signaling safe passage. Letters from veterans describe experiences where code transmitted instructions coincided with protective phenomena. Artillery misfires, enemy hesitation, and paths through terrain that seemed impossibly clear. The intersection of cultural memory language and battlefield success created an invisible network that enhanced cohesion, confidence, and survival. Soldiers began to see code talkers as more than messengers. They were conduits of ancestral power, human links to spiritual guidance, and central figures in the unfolding legend. Even routine patrols became laden with suspense and mystery. Men navigating trenches that had been flooded or obscured by fog reported hearing voices guiding them. Shadows moving ahead to reveal paths and instances where enemy fire inexplicably missed. These occurrences were discussed quietly, sometimes dismissed as fatigue or imagination. Yet consistency across units created a shared mythology code. Talkers were protected, guided, and perhaps empowered by unseen forces. Their words were both tactical tools and spiritual talismans, shaping the battlefield and fortifying courage. The cumulative impact of these rising incidents was profound. Operational success was indisputable. Objectives achieved, units preserved, enemy positions disrupted. Yet, alongside these facts was a rich layer of folklore, ancestral spirits, protective shadows, and the mystical potency of language. Soldiers' diaries, letters, and oral histories preserved this dual reality, creating a complex narrative where survival relied as much on skill and courage as on belief, cultural memory, and the perceived intervention of unseen guardians. Nightfall intensified the tension. Darkness transformed the forest into a living maze, amplifying fear and uncertainty. Patrols moved cautiously, relying on code transmissions, instinct, and the sense of guidance that had developed over weeks in the trenches. Soldiers reported heightened sensory perception, sounds of movement, subtle shifts in the mist, and the faintest whispers in their native languages warning of danger. These experiences reinforced both confidence and awe, solidifying the legend of the code talkers and the notion that survival was intertwined with ancestral presence, cultural continuity, and the living power of language. The forest had witnessed a series of extraordinary incidents. Units navigated impossible terrain, avoided certain death, and executed operations that defied enemy expectation. The code talkers' contributions had proven decisive, simultaneously strategic and mystical. Fact and folklore coexisted, creating a tapestry of history and legend where language itself became a weapon, a shield, and a bridge between past and present, the living and the unseen. The stage was set for the next chapter, P6, where all strands of tension, mystery, and heroism converge into a climactic confrontation with the full weight of history, myth, and battlefield peril. The Argonne Forest had become a world suspended between chaos and order, reality and perception. Weeks of relentless rain had transformed the trenches into flowing rivers of mudshell craters, into hidden pools, and fallen timber into twisted obstacles. Soldiers moved cautiously, boots sinking with every step, weapons weighed down with water and grime. Visibility was minimal, the fog heavy, each movement threatening to be the last. Artillery shells tore through the canopy, their deafening roar shaking the forest and the men within it, while the smell of wet earth, gunpowder, and blood hung thick in the air. Amidst this unrelenting environment, the indigenous code talkers emerged as pivotal figures. Chosen not only for courage, but for fluency in languages impossible for the enemy to decipher, they carried an invisible weapon: their voices. Every order, every message transmitted across the muddy labyrinth orchestrated troop movements with a precision unmatched by any conventional means. Units following code-coordinated instructions executed maneuvers flawlessly, avoided ambushes, and reached objectives that should have been fatal. Yet, alongside these factual successes, a layer of folklore, legend, and inexplicable occurrences intensified, converging toward the story's climax. One operation illustrates the convergence of fact and legend. A platoon was tasked with taking a ridge heavily defended by machine gun nests and concealed artillery. Conventional plans predicted catastrophic casualties. Under the guidance of a Choctaw code talker, the platoon advanced with an almost unnatural coordination. Soldiers later reported that the forest seemed to bend around them. Fallen branches formed natural shields. Mud-covered trenches provided hidden paths, and even enemy fire seemed to divert as if guided away. Diaries described the experience as surreal. It was as if the forest listened to our words, and the code carried with it the presence of our ancestors guiding us. The official after-action report confirms the tactical success, but the soldiers' accounts imbue the operation with an aura of the mystical. Throughout, the offensive, many cases of inexplicable survival continued to accumulate. Scouts navigating flooded trenches reported shadows moving along the edges of the mist, guiding them past hidden dangers. Patrols that should have been detected by enemy forces moved unseen, emerging safely in positions far from expected threat zones. Soldiers wrote in letters that whispers in their own native languages warned them of traps, ambushes, or incoming shell fire, allowing them to avoid fatal outcomes. These reports were repeated across units, forming a shared mythology. The code talkers were protected, guided, and perhaps empowered by unseen forces. Several documented incidents verged on the supernatural. One small squad, separated from its main unit during a night advance, became trapped in a cratered no-man's land. Terrain was treacherous, visibility nearly zero. Using Cherokee code, the code talker relayed precise instructions. Soldiers later described hearing subtle whispers guiding them around hidden obstacles, suggesting paths through areas previously assumed deadly. When they returned to the trench line, they attributed their survival not only to skill, but to ancestral guidance intertwined with the protective power of the code. The environment heightened these events. Fog and rain created a sensory labyrinth. Trenches flooded craters, concealed hazards, and the mist warped perception. Every sound, the splash of boots in mud, the distant boom of artillery, the crack of rifles was amplified, creating near-constant tension. Soldiers' senses became acute. They depended entirely on instinct and code instructions. The cadence, rhythm, and intonation of code became as crucial as the content itself, shaping movements, survival, and morale. Words were lifelines as vital as rifles, bullets, or artillery. Psychologically, the code talker's role transcended communication. Soldiers internalized a dual reality: operational necessity and spiritual presence coexisting. Accounts describe ancestral spirits walking with men in the trenches, whispering guidance, warning of danger, or shaping perception. The code became a bridge between the tangible and intangible, a tool of strategy and a conduit for heritage and protection. Confidence and courage were amplified, fear mitigated, and cohesion strengthened, allowing soldiers to operate in conditions that would have crushed morale elsewhere. As the Argonne offensive progressed, cumulative events created a crescendo. Entire enemy positions were neutralized with minimal casualties. Scouts navigated deadly terrain successfully, and platoons advanced with preternatural precision. Soldiers attributed these outcomes to a combination of linguistic strategy, ancestral intervention, and environmental manipulation. Diaries and letters abound with descriptions of shadows flitting through mist, whispers in native languages, and the sense of being guided by unseen hands. Yet, each incident corresponded to factual operational success, reinforcing the interplay between reality and legend. Many cases of survival became increasingly complex. In one, a unit attempting to flank enemy artillery found its path blocked by a flooded crater and tangled barbed wire. Using Navajo code, the soldiers received instructions that guided them along a circuitous but safe path. Shellfire erupted around them, yet none struck the men, and observers noted that the sequence of explosions seemed almost synchronized with the code's cadence. Another squad reported an enemy ambush appearing to dissolve as they approached, only to learn later that German forces had hesitated, inexplicably leaving the Americans unharmed. These repeated phenomena reinforced the narrative that code and ancestral guidance were intertwined in an invisible protective network. Weather and terrain amplified tension and the sense of the supernatural. Torrential rain obscured vision, turning the battlefield into a slippery, reflective maze. Fog warped perception, shadows shifted unpredictably, and water-filled craters created both traps and unexpected paths. Soldiers described heightened sensory awareness, the sound of approaching shells, the subtle vibration of footsteps, the faintest movement of mist, all cues that dictated survival. In these moments, code instructions were not merely tactical. They acted as psychic anchors guiding soldiers through near-impossible conditions with uncanny accuracy. The folklore reached its peak during final assaults on heavily defended positions. Soldiers reported the presence of unseen figures, sometimes described as ancestral spirits, moving alongside them, guiding actions. Shadows moved in coordination with their steps. Whispered voices warned of incoming fire. The forest seemed alive, responding to the rhythm and cadence of the code. Units advanced in synchrony with a fluidity that defied normal battlefield conditions, achieving objectives that would have otherwise been disastrous. Soldiers' diaries describe a sense of awe and fear, acknowledging both human ingenuity and a force beyond comprehension. In multiple instances, code transmissions coincided with enemy miscalculations. German units misfired artillery, hesitated in advancing, or retreated from positions that were supposedly secure. Soldiers interpreted these events as protective guidance, whether through skillful coordination, instinctive timing, or mystical intervention. The lines between fact and folklore blurred, creating a battlefield where operational success and legend were inseparable. Night operations intensified the climactic tension. Darkness amplified uncertainty, obscuring paths, exaggerating shadows, and amplifying sounds. Patrols relied entirely on code transmissions and instinctual judgment. Soldiers reported a heightened awareness, as if guided by both code and ancestral presence. Shells narrowly missed paths opened where none existed, and enemy observation failed at critical junctures. The dual forces of tactical skill and mystical guidance converged, creating an environment where survival depended on linguistic precision, trust, and belief. By the end of the Argonne, offensive fact and folklore had fully merged. Units reached objectives that should have been impossible. Soldiers survived encounters that seemed fatal, and the legend of the code talkers had solidified. Their contributions were both tangible and ethereal. Operational effectiveness, coupled with ancestral guidance, linguistic strategy, intertwined with spiritual protection. The forest, scarred by artillery and soaked by rain, became a living witness to these intertwined realities. Every trench, every mud-filled crater, every shadowed pathway bore testimony to the code talker's influence. The apex of tension and drama in P6 arrives when all threads converge. Operational success, extreme environmental danger, ancestral intervention, and the mystical resonance of language. Soldiers' diaries, after-action reports, and oral histories collectively illustrate this convergence, creating a rich, layered narrative. The code talkers' voices orchestrated victories, guided survival, and imbued the battlefield with a sense of wonder and awe. Many cases, whispered legends, and documented outcomes formed a labyrinthine climax where fact and folklore were inseparable, pulling the audience deep into the heart of the Argonne and into the world of the silent heroes. Soldiers' survived battles were won, and yet the forest mist and whispers remained. Code talkers had transformed language into weaponry heritage, into strategy and ancestral memory into protection. Fact, folklore, and supernatural perception had converged into a climactic crescendo, leaving the audience poised for the haunting echoes and unresolved mysteries that would conclude the story. The legend of the silent heroes forged in mud mist and the cadence of ancestral tongues reached its zenith. The guns had finally fallen silent over the Argonne Forest. The relentless bombardments, the rain-soaked trenches, and the mud-filled craters lay quiet beneath a gray sky that seemed heavier than before, burdened by the ghosts of war. The forest itself, scarred and battered, held its breath as if mourning the hundreds of lives that had passed through its shadowed paths. Broken trees, twisted wire, and deep shell holes bore witness to the chaos, yet in the silence, there was a lingering, almost sacred reverence. Soldiers emerged from the mud and mist, exhausted, hollow-eyed, carrying memories too heavy for words and experiences that no after-action report could fully capture. The code talkers, whose voices had cut through this chaos, returned to camp, but their impact resonated far beyond the battlefield. Military records noted their operational significance. Units moved with unprecedented precision. Artillery struck targets with flawless coordination, and reconnaissance missions succeeded, where failure seemed inevitable. Official reports credited their linguistic skill with saving countless lives and securing strategic positions. Yet, alongside these verifiable facts, a parallel narrative existed, one preserved in letters, diaries, and oral histories. A story of whispers in the mist, protective shadows, flitting along trench edges, ancestral guidance, and moments where survival bordered on the miraculous. Soldiers who had followed coded instructions recounted a persistent sense that they were accompanied by unseen forces. Some described ancestral spirits walking silently beside them, warning them of shell fire, guiding them through mud-choked craters, or nudging them away from deadly paths. These whispers, carried in the familiar cadence of their native languages, created a unique combination of strategy and spiritual reassurance. Survival depended not only on training and skill, but on the intangible protective network woven through generations of cultural knowledge embedded within the code itself. The forest had become a living witness to these dual realities. Rainwater still pooled in craters where men had fallen. Mud clung to wooden planks and parapets as though preserving the memory of every footstep. Mist lingered in valleys and low-lying areas, wrapping the landscape in an ethereal shroud. Veterans returning decades later reported similar sensations, the air thick with a presence, shadows that seemed familiar, and whispers that could not be explained by wind alone. The land itself, scarred and soaked with history, preserved the echoes of survival guidance and legend. Letters written home from soldiers illustrated the intertwining of fact and folklore. They spoke of operational successes achieved with the guidance of code, yet also described moments when the forest seemed alive, moving to create paths through obstacles, divert artillery shells, or shield them from gunfire. One diary recounted a patrol that had become separated from its main unit. Navigating flooded trenches and crumbling embankments, they followed instructions in Choctaw code. Moments later, soldiers described shadows appearing along the trench edges, guiding them past concealed mines and sniper positions. They emerged from the operation without casualties, attributing their survival to both the code and the unseen guidance of ancestral spirits. The psychological impact on the men was profound. Confidence and morale, constantly tested in the mud, rain, and artillery fire, were buoyed by the presence of code talkers and the sense of ancestral protection. Men trusted the cadence of the code as much as their training. The words themselves became instruments of survival. Shadows and whispers, whether imagined or perceived, reinforced cohesion and courage. Each successful maneuver, each miraculous avoidance of death, was interpreted as confirmation that the code carried power beyond mere communication. It was living, protective, and sacred. Operational records validate the tangible impact of the code talkers. Coordinated attacks succeeded with minimal casualties. Enemy positions fell with precise timing. Scouts navigated terrain that would have been deadly under normal conditions. German intelligence repeatedly failed to decode transmissions, leaving units unprepared for maneuvers they could not anticipate. Yet these factual outcomes coexisted with the folklore preserved in diaries and letters, ancestral guidance, protective whispers, and a forest seemingly responsive to coded instructions. Soldiers' perceptions of the mystical became inseparable from the tactical, creating a layered reality that shaped both survival and legend. Nightfall in the Argonne heightened both tension and wonder. Darkness deepened shadows, obscured pathways, and magnified every sound. The splash of boots, the creak of wet timbers, the distant whistle of artillery shells. Soldiers described moments when code transmissions seemed to resonate beyond mere coordination, creating a rhythm that aligned with environmental cues and survival instincts. The forest seemed to respond, guiding movements through mist and mud, opening paths where none appeared, and providing concealment from enemy observation. Each word spoken in code became both a tactical instruction and a lifeline, infused with ancestral presence. The convergence of fact and folklore reached its zenith during the final stages of the offensive. Multiple platoons, each guided by code talkers, advanced simultaneously under heavy fire. Artillery shells exploded nearby craters filled with water, and the fog masked enemy positions. Yet units moved in synchronicity, navigating treacherous terrain, avoiding machine gun nests, and executing maneuvers with precision that seemed almost preternatural. Soldiers later reported feeling unseen, hands guiding them, whispers in their native languages warning of danger, and a pervasive sense that the forest itself had aligned with their mission. Operational success and mystical perception coalesced into a single, incisive, intense experience of survival and triumph. The aftermath left an indelible impression. Survivors carried both the physical scars of war and the psychological weight of experiences that defied explanation. Stories of ancestral protection, whispers in the mist, and the guiding power of language were preserved in diaries, letters, and oral histories. Veterans spoke of the forest's lingering presence years later, the way shadows shifted, how fog clung to familiar paths, and the sensation of being watched, guided, or accompanied. These echoes reinforced the enduring legend of the silent heroes, creating a narrative that was both historical and mystical. The forest, scarred yet alive, bore witness to the synthesis of tactical genius and cultural memory. Each trench, each crater, each mud-soaked path preserved the imprint of both strategy and legend. Soldiers' survival, operational success, and the repeated convergence of unexplainable phenomena established the code talkers as central figures in a story that transcended ordinary military history. Words became weapons language, became strategy, and heritage became an instrument of survival. Fact and folklore intertwined to create a labyrinthine narrative that drew participants and later historians into a complex, multi-layered reality. Even decades later, the echoes endure. Veterans' descendants, historians, and visitors to the Argonne Forest have recounted sensations of presence, whispers, and guidance. The physical landscape still bears the scars of battle, shell-cratered earth, hollowed trees, and remnants of trenches. Yet, the intangible traces, the rhythm of words, the lingering mist, the memory of ancestral guidance persist. They serve as a reminder that survival in the Argonne was shaped by more than strategy and skill. It was entwined with heritage language and something beyond comprehension. The legend of the Code Talkers is thus twofold: measurable, undeniable impact on the battlefield, and a mystical spiritual presence that informed perception, morale, and survival. Diaries, letters, and oral histories preserve these dual narratives, creating a complex, haunting, and deeply human tapestry. Soldiers' experiences illustrate the interplay between skill and intuition, fact and folklore, and human courage and ancestral guidance. The forest remains a living monument to these events, its mist, shadows, and scars echoing with stories that continue to intrigue, inspire, and unsettle. The final image is one of echoes. Rain pooling in shell craters, mud caked to wooden planks. Mist lingering along pathways once tread by soldiers and code talkers. Shadows stretch along the landscape, whispering stories of survival, ancestral guidance, and the living power of language. The code talker's legacy remains hidden, yet indelible, etched into the very terrain of the Argonne Forest. Their words, their courage, and their unseen guardianship endure an enduring testament to human ingenuity and the mystical resonance of heritage. As we leave the forest, questions remain. How much of survival was human skill, and how much was ancestral guidance or the living force of language? Could the forest itself have responded to the cadence of code, or was it the perception of exhausted men interpreting signs in the fog? These questions linger unanswered, yet they preserve the mystery, the awe, and the haunting presence of the silent heroes. You have witnessed a world where mud, mist, and code transformed survival into legend. Where language became weapon, heritage became strategy, and courage intertwined with unseen guidance. The story of the silent heroes is unfinished, waiting to be remembered, explored, and perhaps understood. To uncover more hidden histories, to walk further into the labyrinth of fact and folklore, subscribe and continue exploring the echoes of the past. The Code Talkers changed the course of the battle, yet many secrets remain unsolved. What do you think still lies hidden in the Argonne mist? Share your guesses below.